Hey, good morning. It's Uncle Lou here. Yeah, that's right. It's me, Uncle Lou, live for you on LouTube today. And thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Ranking the SEC coaches today, or who's the second best coach in the SEC, right? I mean, as much as I hate Alabama and Nick Saban, you can't make a list of best coaches in the SEC and not have Nick Saban at number one. So there's no point in trying to build up some kind of drama or anticipation about who's going to be number one on this list. Obviously, it'll be Nick Saban. But as I was going through these coaches, I noticed that there's a couple of groups of coaches that were hard to place. One in front of the other. There's two or three groups of coaches here where you could flip-flop the order and make just as good of an argument for that ranking as you could for the one that I ended up using. But anyway, let's go ahead and go through the list here. As usual, we're going to do it from worst to first. So we'll start with the 14th best coach in the SEC and work our way down to Nick Saban. Quick before we start though, the live show that I normally do on Mondays and Wednesdays at 3 o'clock is going to be on Wednesdays and Fridays this week. I have something I have to do with my daughter this afternoon, so I'm not able to do the 3 o'clock show today. Still going to do two shows this week. We've done this once before. We're just going to move it to Wednesday and Friday. So sorry if that's an inconvenience for anybody, but unfortunately I'm just not able to do it today at 3. So the afternoon show will be Wednesday and Friday at 3 o'clock this week. All right, let's get on with the list here without any further ado. All right, number 14 on my list. And like I said, there's a couple of groups of coaches on this list that were hard to do and could be flip-flopped, and these first couple of coaches fall into that category. But at 14, I have Jeremy Pruitt. He's never coached a game, and he's coming into a really bad situation. This isn't a trash talk video. But let's just be realistic. Tennessee was one of the worst teams in the Power 5 last year. They were winless in conference, and their program in a lot of ways has turned more into a joke than it has a powerhouse as it has been at times in the past. I mean, Tennessee has had some really good teams. The late 90s in particular, they were really, really good. And even going back further than that, they had some great teams. But they've struggled for a while now. They haven't won the East in over 10 years. It's been 20 years since they won the SEC. They've had, their fifth coach now since 2007. Fulmer, Dooley, Kiffin, Lyle, and now Jeremy Pruitt. Jeremy Pruitt never coached a game. He's an elite defensive mind, an elite defensive coordinator without question. Bounced around Alabama, Florida State, Georgia, back to Alabama again. No one questions his defensive IQ or his defensive coaching ability, but being a head coach of a team, a totally different animal than being a coordinator. We saw Kirby Smart struggle in his first year in Athens after being a long-time defensive coordinator under Nick Saban. He had some bumps in the road for him his first year, and I fully expect the same thing to happen for Jeremy Pruitt. They also have a brutal schedule this year, and because there's just not a whole lot of information to go on with Jeremy Pruitt, I had to put him 14th on this list. All right, 13th, Mississippi State, is it Joe Moorhead? Another guy that you just don't have enough information about to accurately place within a coach's ranking list. Not a whole lot to go off of on this guy. And Mississippi State, not traditionally an elite team, although over the last 5 to 10 years under Dan Mullen, they have been a better program overall than Tennessee. That's really the only justification I have for putting Moorhead ahead of Jeremy Pruitt on this list. Like I said, if you want to move Pruitt up a spot or two on this list, I can make arguments for that too, so I completely understand that. This is not a shot at Tennessee. But Mississippi State has just had a better team. I feel like Moorhead is inheriting a better situation in Starkville than Pruitt is in Knoxville. That's really the only reason. He has a proven leader at quarterback and Nick Fitzgerald for this year. That's something Tennessee doesn't have. They played multiple quarterbacks last year. No one really knows who's going to play quarterback for Tennessee this year. It's not an issue at Mississippi State. They got Nick Fitzgerald coming back from an injury in the Egg Bowl last year, but he should be fine. Everything I've heard, all the indications are that he'll be ready to go 100% without limitations week 1. So that's why I have more ahead of Pruitt on this list. I just feel like he's coming into a better situation right now than Pruitt is. Now, we'll see over time. Tennessee has been a better program than Mississippi State. So if Pruitt ends up being a pretty good head coach, then it shouldn't take long for the Tennessee program to surpass where the Mississippi State program is right now. And then there would be no argument against having Pruitt behind Moorhead. All right, number 12 on the list, I have Ole Miss head coach. Is it Matt Luke? I think Matt Luke. Another situation that's sort of hard to rank. He was named interim head coach last year, now promoted to permanent head coach. Ole Miss is in a world of trouble with the NCAA. They're working on scholarship restrictions and bowl bans. Hard to judge a coach under those circumstances and conditions, especially a coach that's in those circumstances and conditions. Not for something he did. He didn't have anything to do with what was going on at Ole Miss. Obviously, that was Hugh Freeze and some of the other people around him. They're all gone. So another guy that's kind of hard to rank here. Honestly, I was surprised they went, 6-6 last year under Luke. I thought they would be a little bit worse with no real motivation to play. They've lost some players this year, notably their quarterback, Shea Patterson. So we'll see how he does this year, if they can maintain a record at or around 500, or if they dip to the 3, 4, 5 win mark. We'll see. But really hard to judge this guy. But again, Ole Miss, that's the thing with Ole Miss and Tennessee. It's just two programs that are in bad shape for two totally different reasons, but it makes it hard to judge first or second year coaches. All right, number 11 on the list, and again, I sort of struggle with where to put this guy too, but Missouri head coach Barry Odom. Missouri won the East a couple of times under the previous head coach, a guy that had been there forever. They promoted this guy, Barry Odom, from within. I think he was defensive coordinator there, may have been the defensive line coach, but in any case, he had been there for a while. They promoted him to head coach, and things just haven't gone well. They haven't been able to match the success that they had early on when they came into the SEC. Of course, the East was kind of down then. Some would argue it's still down now. But Missouri has really taken a nosedive over the last couple of years. They started, I believe, 1-5 last year before winning their last 5 or 6 games to become bowl eligible at 6-6. But of course, they lost to Texas in the bowl game, finishing at 6-7. Just really underwhelmed at Missouri. And the sort of strange thing about it is, really, when Missouri was at its best, it was because of its defense. And now when you look at Missouri, it's the exact opposite. When Missouri came into the SEC, it's like they adopted an SEC mindset of defense first, and it served them well. Like I mentioned, they won the East a couple of times, won a lot of games. Now when you look at Missouri, it almost looks like a Big 12 school. They have Drew Lock, one of the best quarterbacks in the SEC. The guy can sling the ball. He'll throw for 4,000 yards, no question. But they just have absolutely no defense. I mean, Missouri's only real goal or chance at winning meaningful games is to outscore opponents every single time. And like I talk about all the time, that's going to work a lot of the time against inferior teams, but your quarterback's going to have an off day. You're going to run into a defense that slows your offense down. And when you don't have a defense to rely on, to fall back on, it's hard to win games. So I'm not sure if I expect much more out of Missouri this year than what we saw last year. I find it hard to believe they would start off as bad this year as they did last year. So it wouldn't surprise me if they won a couple more games overall than they did last year, maybe finishing with 7 or 8 wins as opposed to the 6 they finished with last year. All right, into the top 10 here now, and I have Mark Stoops, head coach Kentucky, at number 10. And the argument can be made that he could be higher on this list, and I understand that. And I'm going to tell you why I put him at 10, and I even thought about putting him a little lower than this. Kentucky is a school traditionally it's very hard to win at. They're sort of like Vanderbilt in that way. Coaches come in there. There is no expectation of winning 10, 11 games or winning division titles or conference titles or anything like that. The goal at these type of programs, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, is really bowl eligibility, right? But I look at Kentucky last year, mainly the game they lost against Florida, and there's the only thing to blame that loss on is coaching, pure and simple. Now, whether you want to blame it on head coach Mark Stoops or you want to blame it on coordinators or whatever, listen, doo-doo rolls downhill, right? Stoops makes the big money. He's the guy at the top of the chart. Everything falls on him, good or bad. That Florida game, not putting enough men on the field multiple times, blowing a lead at home in your first chance to beat Florida in over 30 years, inexcusable. That 100% falls on the coaching, and that's why I have Stoops this low on this list. All right, coming in at number 9 on the list, SEC coaches, I have Vanderbilt head coach Derek Mason. I like Derek Mason. I think he's done a good job at Vanderbilt. The argument can be made that they underperformed a little bit the last year or two. I mean, they've got an above-average quarterback over the last couple of years in Shermer. They had their best running back in school history in Ralph Webb. The defense has been okay at times. I expected more out of Vanderbilt, particularly last year, than what we ended up seeing. I don't think Vanderbilt ever really recovered from the back-to-back drubbings they received from Alabama and Georgia last year. Not really fair to judge a team on losses to Georgia and Alabama. A lot of teams did lose to Georgia and Alabama last year, and a lot of teams would have lost to Georgia and Alabama last year had they played. But, I mean, Vanderbilt just got absolutely annihilated in both of those games. I think the total score was over 100-10 or whatever it was. It was brutal, and they never really recovered from that. They had a big early win against Kansas State. Kansas State was ranked, I think, 18th at the time early on in the season. Things were looking good for Vanderbilt, and it kind of just fell apart towards the end. But Vanderbilt, very hard place to win at, very hard place to recruit to because of very high academic standards. Again, one of these schools that's not expecting a head coach to come in and win 10, 11 games. But they did have James Franklin before Derek Mason, and he elevated that program to a certain level, and Derek Mason has not been able to duplicate the achievements that James Franklin had at Vandy. Now, James Franklin, as it turns out, is probably one of the top 5 or 10 coaches in America. He's at Penn State now. That got him to contending for Big Ten titles every single year, played in the Rose Bowl, playoff contenders late into the season the last couple of years. So, you know, just because he's not as good as James Franklin, I don't think means he's not a good coach. But I have been a little disappointed, but like I said, I think this is a fair place to put him in. He's made a couple of bowl games. They've won a couple of big games, or you know, they beat Georgia a couple of years ago. So some good wins under his belt. Not an elite coach, not an elite program, but considering what you get when you are head coach of a school like Vanderbilt, I think he's done an okay job. All right, at number 8, I have Chad Morris, and disclaimer here. I'm a Chad Morris fan. I'm high on Chad Morris. I liked what he did at Clemson. He really was one of the architects of getting that offense turned around under Dabo years ago. Of course, he left, became head coach at SMU, turned them around, and now he gets a shot at Arkansas. He may be a better coach than where I have him on this list when it's all said and done. The problem, and I've talked about this before, the style of offense that he runs really couldn't be any different than the style of offense that Brett Bielema was running at Arkansas. Brett Bielema, 340-pound offensive lineman, a lot of running the ball, a lot of big bowling ball type running backs. Chad Morris likes to spread the field out and sling it around. And you just don't have the personnel, the body types, and the athletes at Arkansas right now that Chad Morris needs to successfully run that style of offense. Now, do I think he can come in and make an immediate improvement just based off of coaching alone? Yes, I do. Brett Bielema was a huge flop and disappointment at Arkansas. I think Arkansas will be better off immediately with Chad Morris. Are they going to contend for an SEC West title or even win 9 or 10 games this year? I don't think so. Probably not. Like I said, he needs at least 2 full recruiting cycles on top of the 18 cycle that he sort of mopped up at the end. But he needs a 19 and a 20 recruiting cycle to sort of get his style of player in there so that they can open up that offense and run the type of offense and play the type of football that a Chad Morris coach team wants to play. So I think this is a good spot to have him on this list. I think he's definitely a better head coach, or has the potential to be a better head coach than everyone below him on this list, right? Now, obviously, Pruitt, we don't know how that's going to go, but I'm a Chad Morris fan, and I think potentially he could move up this list if he stays in the SEC another couple of years, which I fully expect he will. That brings us to number 7, Ed Orgeron. And if Chad Morris could have been a little higher on this list, then you could make the argument that Ed Orgeron could be a little lower. An inexcusable head-scratching loss to last year. And again, I'm not a fan of Ed Orgeron. I tried to be as fair as I could. I think my first draft at making this list, I think I had Ed Orgeron at 10. So I ended up moving him up a little bit. Now, I'm just going to be honest here. I think any success Ed Orgeron has at LSU is 90% due to the players that he has. I am not a believer or a fan in Ed Orgeron as a head coach. I'm not. I don't think LSU will ever win the West with Ed Orgeron or anything above that. But LSU recruits at a high level. They put a ton of players in the NFL, so they are a talented team. Any success LSU has, I think you have to give credit to the players and maybe the coordinators if you can never get that situation figured out. Their offense has been pretty much abysmal over the last couple of years, even though they've had two of the top running backs in the SEC in Fournette and Geis. The quarterback play terrible. No offensive creativity at all. The defense has sort of carried them. So we'll see now that he's been there a couple of 2 or 3 years and had a couple of recruiting cycles and sort of a learn on the go type of thing. I mean, he's played all these teams in the SEC a couple of times now, or in the West at least. He's got Georgia coming this year. So the schedule's not easy. Got to play Auburn, got to play Alabama, got to play Mississippi State, got to play Jimbo Fisher and Texas A&M, and you got Georgia coming as your crossover game from the East, playing Baton Rouge in the middle of the season. And that Georgia game comes at a bad time for LSU. If you look at their schedule, it's sandwiched between a couple of big games for them. But anyway, so it wouldn't surprise me to see LSU struggle this year. I'm trying to be fair by putting Ed Orgeron here. Like I said, in the first draft when I went through this, the first time I had him, I think ranked 10th. So I did move him up a couple of spots, but I'm just not a believer in Ed Orgeron. All right, and that brings us to the top 6. And I say 6 instead of 5 because I went through a couple of different variations of this top 6 here. I had these 6 coaches in my top 6 every draft of this list I made, but I did change it around a few times. And as I go through the list here, there's one statistic I'm going to list for each coach. And this was sort of just dumb luck that this worked out this way. This was the final 6 I settled on based on a lot of different things. And after I had settled on this list, I looked up winning percentage for each coach, and you'll see how this sort of lines up. So you can argue with this top 6 if you want, and there's points that can be made to move these coaches around a little bit. But I think I have pretty solid reasoning here for where I have this top 6. So here we go, the UNCLELOU top 6 coaches in the SEC. At number 6, I have Will Muschamp. Now, there's a few coaches who there's going to be some people who think this is way too high for Will Muschamp, and I get it. He was a total dud at Florida. I understand. He totally bombed at Florida. He was in over his head. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't have the experience for that job, and he just wasn't ready. He leaves there as a coordinator for a couple of years at Auburn. Now he lands at South Carolina, a school that doesn't have nearly the amount of expectations that Florida has. Sure, you got some South Carolina fans that obviously would like to be winning the East and the SEC and things like that, but you just don't have near the pressure and expectations in Columbia, South Carolina that you do in Gainesville, Florida. You just don't, and I think Will Muschamp has benefited from that. You look at his recruiting classes at South Carolina, and they sort of mirror what we saw at Florida, getting some pretty good defensive guys. He got kind of, I don't know if you want to call it luck. Luck's probably not the right word, but he landed Jake Bentley right away when he got to South Carolina, has played this guy from day one, and he's been an above average SEC quarterback. And of course, offense was really his downfall at Florida. He changed offensive coordinators. He couldn't get consistent quarterback play. He has solved that riddle at South Carolina, at least in terms of the consistent quarterback play. Jake Bentley's not the best quarterback in the SEC, but you know what you're getting with him. He throws for a lot of yards. You got Deebo Samuel, one of the best wide receivers in the SEC, and stability at quarterback has helped Will Muschamp at South Carolina. They haven't won the East. Came in second last year. What, they finished 9-4? Is that right? I believe they finished 9-4. Look at their schedule this year. They got a very good chance of winning 10 games this year. And you got to remember, Will Muschamp inherited a 3-win team at South Carolina. They were 3-9 Spurs last year. Muschamp comes in, goes 6-6, right? Then loses a bowl game, 6-7. and then last year improves that to 9-4. So an upward trajectory at South Carolina for Will Muschamp. Good, solid recruiting classes. He's got Jake Bentley for this season and one more. So the quarterback position is going to be solidified for at least another couple of years. And he has won, is it 57%? 57% of his games. And that's sort of the key stat to remember here as I go through this top 6. Will Muschamp has won 57% of his games. I have him at number 6 on the list. Number 5 on the list, I have Dan Mullen. People are going to argue he should be higher. He's won 60% of his games, okay? So he's won 3% more of his games than Will Muschamp. And that's taking into account the fact that Will Muschamp was a total dud at Florida. And people are going to say, well, Lou, Will Muschamp or Dan Mullen was at Mississippi State. They're not a traditional power. Well, neither is South Carolina, okay? South Carolina's never won the SEC, ever. They've won the East once, only once. So actually, South Carolina and Mississippi State are similar in a lot of ways. And, Will Muschamp has done okay there. Dan Mullen did okay at Mississippi State. But Dan Mullen's got 60% winning percentage. Muschamp 57. So I've got Mullen at 5th here. Comes into Florida, of course. He's a Florida man, right? We know that expectations are sky high in Florida. I think they're a couple of years away from being true contenders in the SEC. The offense, I'm still not a believer in. I don't think they have a quarterback that's good enough to take them where they want to go. We'll see. Dan Mullen's supposed to be a quarterback genius, so we'll see what he can do with Felipe Franks, Kyle Trask, and Emory Jones if he can turn any of those guys into a consistent winner. But I have Dan Mullen, new head coach at Florida, number 5 on the Uncle Lou list. All right, number 4 on Uncle Lou's list, ranking the SEC coaches, I have Auburn head coach Gus Malzahn, and he has won 67% of his games. So an increase over Muschamp and Mullen. He's won 67%. He's won the West a couple of times, won the SEC once, and played in one national title game. This is a guy who's been on the hot seat a couple of different times in Auburn. Last year in particular, you had about at least half the fan base after that loss to LSU wanted him fired. He rebounds, beats Georgia and Alabama at home. Both were ranked number 1 at the time. Makes the SEC championship game before getting brutalized by UGA. So consistency has been the issue with Gus Malzahn. Consistency and the inability to recruit a decent quarterback. He's been unable to put together back-to-back 10-win seasons. So it's a little bit of up and down with Gus Malzahn at Auburn. Last season, won 10 games. If it holds true to form, they'll take a dive this year and win 8 or 9. We'll see. That's been the problem. He's yet to recruit a single quarterback out of high school that's been any good. The quarterbacks he's had success with have been transfers from other schools. I've talked about that. I did a whole video on this. I'll try to remember to link it up there if I can. But the quarterbacks he's recruited out of high school, people like John Franklin III, Jeremy Johnson, Sean White. I mean, these people, you forget these people even existed. Quarterbacks he's had success with. Jared Stibaloni, of course, came from Baylor, and even going back to when Gus Malzahn was a coordinator at Auburn under Gene Chizik, Cam Newton, they got from Florida, then to a junior college, of course, before landing at Auburn. So for a guy that's supposed to be an offensive genius, a quarterback guru, whatever, he hasn't had a good track record at evaluating high school talent in terms of the quarterback position and transitioning that to the college level. Hasn't had any success at all. Been very inconsistent, has gotten completely owned and dominated by his 2 biggest rivals, Georgia and Alabama. He's got a losing record to both Georgia and Alabama during his time at Auburn, and that's not something that Auburn administration or Auburn fans are going to put up with for very long. They did just give this guy a huge raise and extension, which made absolutely no sense to most people with a brain. $7 million a year after getting drubbed by Georgia in the SEC championship game and then not even showing up for the bowl game and getting beat by a one-armed man in Central Florida in Atlanta. So they've currently lost 2 games in a row at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. If they lose 3 games in a row, because of course they play Washington week 1 in a neutral site kickoff game in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. If they lose that game, that'll be 3 in a row they've lost in Atlanta. Gus Malzahn has struggled on the road, been a totally different team at home. Last year beats Georgia and Alabama, like I mentioned, both at home, both of which were ranked number 1 at the time. Losses last year on the road at Clemson, on the road at LSU, neutral site against Georgia, neutral site against Central Florida. So a different team away from Jordan-Hare. We'll see what happens here week 1. The expectations have to be higher for Gus Malzahn this year after getting a raise up to $7 million. I mean, he's one of the highest paid coaches in America today. Who makes more than Gus Malzahn? Nick Saban. Jim Harbaugh, that's all I can think of off the top of my head without looking it up. Kirby got a raise to $7 billion, so he makes the same as Gus. But as far as who makes more, not very many. So you got to be winning some conference titles or making some playoffs if you're one of the top 2 or 3 paid coaches in America. We'll see what happens with Auburn Tigers and Gus Malzahn this coming season. All right, and that brings us to 3-2-1, and I'm just looking at the percentages here. And I already told you Nick Saban was going to be number 1 on this list. Okay, he's won 87% of his games. So contrast that to what we've already talked about. Muschamp at 6, 57% of his games. Mullen at 5, 60% of his games. Gus at 4, 67% of his games. Saban number 1, 87% of his games. So Saban has won 20% more of his games than Gus Malzahn. So 2 and 3, and there's only 2 coaches left. You figured it out by now, Jimbo Fisher and Kirby Smart. So who's number 3? Who's number 2? I struggled on this. I went back and forth a bunch of times, and the bottom line for me is it doesn't matter to me how you did it or who you did it with, or was it a flash in the pan with Jameis Winston or was it not? Can you repeat that success somewhere else? We'll see. I had to put Jimbo Fisher number 2. If you win a national title, he's one of only, I think there's only 3 or 4 active coaches right now in the entire NCAA that have won a national title, and Jimbo Fisher is one of them. So I had to put Jimbo Fisher number 2 and Kirby Smart number 3. Now, Kirby Smart could easily surpass Jimbo Fisher over the next couple of years if Kirby has another couple of great years like he had last year, or even wins a national title. And we'll see what Jimbo can do at Texas A&M. Kevin Sumlin struggled there. We'll see how it works out for Jimbo. But the winning percentages here, and again, it fit into the way everything else was. Again, Saban, 87%. Jimbo Fisher, 78%. Kirby Smart, 75%. Okay, Gus, 67. Mullen, 60. Muschamp, 57. Now, again, I didn't just look up the winning percentages and then put the coaches in that order. It just worked out that way. I know there are arguments to be made to move some of these coaches around. Kirby has done in 2 years what it took. Kirby has accomplished as much in 2 years as Gus Malzahn has in 5. That's why I have Kirby ahead of Gus Malzahn. Jimbo Fisher won a national title with Jameis Winston. No one else on this list has won a national title. That's why he's number 2. And obviously, Nick Saban has won 5 natties in 9 years at Bama. He's won 6 total going back to LSU. No reason not to have him number 1 on this list. That would just be ridiculous. Of course, it took, it was his 3rd year at Bama, right, that Saban won a national title. They were terrible in 2007. They got beat in the SEC championship game in 2008. So Kirby technically ahead of the curve as it goes with Nick Saban. Nick Saban won the SEC title game in his 2nd year, or Kirby Smart won the SEC title game in his 2nd year in the SEC. Nick Saban lost the SEC title game his 2nd year at Bama and then won the national title his 3rd year. We'll see what happens with Kirby this year and Saban and the other guys on this list here. But I really think this is fair here. Obviously, when you're making a list of 14 coaches like this, there's going to be a bunch of different opinions. So if I got one totally wrong, if I blew one here, let me know in the comments down below. I'm open to maybe some suggestions on changing these around, but I feel like overall this list is pretty fair. I tried to be objective. Obviously, I didn't put Kirby Smart number 1. I didn't even put him number 2. And there are some lists out there you can find that have Kirby Smart ranked ahead of Jimbo Fisher in terms of coaching. So I didn't, I try not to be a homer here. I hate Gus Malzahn, but I still have him 4th on this list. South Carolina is my most hated team. I still have Muschamp 6th on this list. People are going to say, oh, no, you hate Tennessee. That's why you put Pruitt last. The guy's never coached a game. So, I don't know what to make of him, okay? He lost his spring game. Really, the closest he's ever come to head coaching a game was the spring game at Tennessee, and Tennessee lost. And that's according to Jeremy Pruitt, not according to Lou, okay? Jeremy Pruitt comes out, says the team quit, and then rags on the fans for not showing up. So, anyway, that's it. The Uncle Lou list ranking the SEC head coaches for 2018, 14, all the way down to 1. Don't forget, no live show today. The live shows this week, the afternoon shows, will be Wednesday and Friday at 3 o'clock Eastern. That's a call-in show. If you've never seen that, you should check it out. I take viewer phone calls. People argue with me. We talk about football, talk about your team, talk about your whatever. It's just a call-in show. Talk about whatever you want. Check that out if you haven't. That's going to be this Wednesday and Friday at 3 o'clock Eastern. And I really appreciate you guys watching. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you're not already. Share this video with your friends, and I will see you guys on the next video. Have a great morning.